Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex.
I'm Eve.
Okay, so we're diving into Sarah Bakewell's at the Existentialist Café. Freedom, being, and apricot cocktails. You shared this one, and I have to say, it looks like we're about to explore some pretty big questions, right? Like life, freedom, existence itself. We've got a lot to cover. All those key figures in existentialism, their ideas, and, well, the whole crazy ride of the 20th century that kind of shaped their thinking.
Yeah, you know what I think is so fascinating about this book? It's how Bakewell, she just brings these philosophers down to earth. I mean, she doesn't just tell you about their ideas, she shows you how they lived, how they loved, how they argued, even how they drank. Apricot cocktails, no less. And all while they're like wrestling with these huge philosophical questions.
Yeah, it really does make you feel like you're right there with them, right? In those smoky Parisian cafes, like you said. But before we get totally lost in the philosophical haze here, tell me, who is Sarah Bakewell? And why should we trust her to be our guide through this world?
Good question. Bakewell, she's British, a biographer and a philosopher. And she's got this amazing knack for making even really complicated ideas, understandable, even fun. I mean, you probably know some of her other work. She's written about other big thinkers like Montaigne. And at the Existentialist Café, she's tackling some of the most important existentialist figures of the 20th century. But she does it by weaving together their biographies and philosophies. It's informative, but it's also a really good story.
Okay, I'm sold. So let's jump right in. In the first chapter, Bakewell drops us into this crucial moment that kind of sparked existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of existence precedes essence. Can you break that down for us? I mean, what does it even mean?
So Bakewell, she talks about how Sartre, he had this epiphany, right? It was after he overheard a conversation in a cafe in Berlin. Someone used the term existentialism, and it grabbed him. Later on, he kind of explained this idea as a total rejection of traditional philosophy, the kind that starts with the idea that there's this fixed human nature. Sartre just flipped it. He's like, man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. First, we exist like a blank canvas, and then through our choices and actions, we create our essence, our identity.
So it's like saying we're not born with this predetermined purpose or meaning. We're free to define ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. But that freedom can be pretty liberating, but it can also be terrifying, right? It's liberating because it means we have the power to shape our own destinies, like you said. But it's terrifying because it means we are entirely responsible for every choice we make. Like Sartre said, we are condemned to be free.
Condemned to be free. I mean, wow, that's a pretty heavy thought. Is he saying freedom is a burden?
It can be, definitely. Because if there aren't any preset rules, right? No guidelines, then we're the ones who have to figure out what's right and wrong, what's meaningful, and what's not. And that's a lot of pressure.
Definitely makes you think about the choices you make and why you're making them. Now, Bakewell mentions that Sartre, he was really influenced by phenomenology, right? That's his philosophical approach that's all about experiencing the world directly without preconceptions.
Yeah.
How did that shape his thinking?
Phenomenology was like training for Sartre's existentialism,
Yeah.
It's about really paying close attention to the world, the raw data of your senses. It's about not letting, assumptions and biases cloud your perception. Think of it like seeing the world through the eyes of a child with that sense of wonder and curiosity, not through the lens of pre-existing categories and judgments and all that.
So instead of seeing, I don't know, a tree like we've been taught to label it, you might see the specific way the light hits its leaves, the rough texture of the bark, the pattern of its branches, all without labeling it.
Exactly. And this way of experiencing the world, this being super attentive to the present moment, well, it fed right into Sartre's ideas about freedom and responsibility. If you can really see the world without these preconceptions, then you're also more open to the possibility of creating yourself anew in each moment, of making choices that are truly your own.
Now that's a powerful idea. Okay, so Bakewell, she takes us back to the 1930s, and she introduces us to this whole cast of characters who were shaping existentialism. Let's start with Edmund Husserl, often called the father of phenomenology.
Yeah.
Who was this guy? What was he all about?
Okay, so Husserl, he was a German philosopher, and he was obsessed with understanding consciousness itself. Bakewell calls him the magician from Messkirch, and she paints this picture of him as this intensely focused, meticulous thinker, like he dedicated his whole life to uncovering the secrets of how our minds actually work.
So he was almost like mapping the inner landscape of the mind, right? Like he explored, charting some uncharted territory.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He developed this incredibly rigorous method. He called it bracketing, where you try to set aside all your assumptions and biases and you just focus on the pure experience of consciousness. He was trying to get to the bottom of how our minds work, how we experience the world and what it means to be conscious. He even used this method to explore really simple experiences like drinking a cup of coffee, trying to break the experience down into its fundamental parts.
Wow. Okay, so Husserl was all about analyzing the nuts and bolts of consciousness. But how did his ideas influence existentialism?
Well, Husserl's work, it provided the foundation for a lot of key existentialist ideas. His focus on lived experience, the subjective way that we each perceive and interact with the world, right? It was crucial for thinkers like Sartre, for example, the way Husserl focused on understanding the world from the inside out, rather than, imposing external theories or frameworks on our experiences. Hugely influential for existentialism.
So Husserl laid the groundwork, the tools for understanding consciousness. And Sartre took those tools and built his ideas about freedom, responsibility, all that on top of them.
Precisely. And it wasn't just Sartre. A lot of existentialist thinkers, including Simone de Beauvoir and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, they built on Husserl's work too. They explored how, our lived experiences shape how we understand ourselves and the world.
Okay, so it's like Husserl was the architect who laid the foundation, and then Sartre and all these other existentialists came along and built these incredible structures on top of it. Now, Bakewell also introduces us to Martin Heidegger, Husserl's student, who took phenomenology in a completely different direction. So what was Heidegger's, deal?
Okay, Heidegger. He was, let's just say, a complex and controversial figure. A brilliant philosopher, but his involvement with the Nazi Party, well, it's cast a long shadow over his legacy.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult aspect of his story to grapple with.
Yeah.
But let's focus on his philosophical contributions for now. What were some of his key ideas, and how did they differ from Husserl's?
Well, while Husserl was focused on the structures of consciousness, Heidegger was more interested in being, with a capital B. He wanted to understand not just what things are, but what it means for anything to be at all. Bakewell describes him like climbing a mountain path and asking himself, why is there something rather than nothing? He felt that Western philosophy had kind of lost sight of this really fundamental question. It had gotten bogged down in analyzing specific entities rather than, grappling with the very ground of existence itself.
Whoa. That's a mind-bending question. And how did he try to answer it?
Heidegger believed that the way to understand being was to examine our own existence, what he called our being in the world. He argued that we as humans were not separate from the world, We're always already embedded in it. Our existence is always situated, contextual, relational. He even coined this term dessen to refer to this unique way that humans exist, this being there that's always engaged with the world around us.
So he's saying we're not just observers. We're active participants in the world, shaping it and being shaped by it.
That's a great way to put it. Heidegger believed that our understanding of being, it's always intertwined with our own personal experiences, our history, our culture, even the specific circumstances of our lives.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like he's emphasizing the importance of individual perspective and lived experience, which ties back to phenomenology and existentialism.
Absolutely. And his ideas about being in the world and design, they had a huge influence on existentialist thinkers like Sartre. They used those concepts to explore ideas about freedom, about responsibility, about the interconnectedness of human existence, all of it.
It's amazing how all these different philosophical threads are weaving together.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that Bakewell highlights is the really dramatic backdrop against which all these ideas were developing, right?
Yeah.
The rise of Nazism, World War II. How did all that turmoil impact existentialist thought?
It had a really profound impact. It forced people to confront, the fragility of life, the reality of suffering, the seeming absurdity of human existence, especially in the face of violence and destruction on such a massive scale. And a lot of existentialist thinkers, they were directly affected by the war. Sartre, for instance, he was captured by the Germans. He spent 9 months as a prisoner of war. And that experience, along with the broader horrors of the war, really shaped his thinking about freedom, responsibility, the meaning of life, everything.
I mean, it makes sense, right? In a world where everything felt like it was falling apart, people would start grappling with these really basic questions. about existence, purpose,
Yeah.
about the choices we make when we're faced with, these extreme situations.
Exactly. The existentialists, they were living through this time of profound crisis, and their philosophy reflects that. It reflects the struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that seemed to have lost its moorings. They were trying to understand how to live authentically, how to make choices that mattered in a world that often felt meaningless. Absurd, even.
Now, thankfully, Bakewell doesn't just focus on the men in this story. She gives Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong partner and a brilliant philosopher in her own right, equal billing.
And she should. De Beauvoir was an essential figure in existentialism, and Bakewell makes that really clear. She focuses on de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, which explored how womanhood is a social and cultural construction. De Beauvoir, she challenged traditional gender roles, arguing that women, just like men, are free to create their own destinies.
Even the title itself, The Second Sex, is so powerful.
Right.
It instantly implies this hierarchy, that women are defined in relation to men, not as independent beings.
That's exactly right. And de Beauvoir's book, it was this powerful argument for women's liberation. It dismantled those traditional gender roles and argued that women are just as capable as men of shaping their own lives, of making their own choices.
And it wasn't just The Second Sex. She wrote novels, essays, plays. She was deeply involved in political activism. She really embodies this idea of existentialism as a lived philosophy, right? A way of being in the world, of fighting for a more just future.
She did. And one of the things that makes Bakewell's book so engaging is how she doesn't just tell us about these philosophers' ideas, she brings them to life, She does it through stories and quotes. She makes them feel real.
Right, like that part where she describes Sartre wandering through Paris. He's experiencing the city, the sights, sounds, smells with this heightened awareness.
Yeah.
And it's all inspired by his phenomenological training. Bakewell, she writes, he started to experience the world as a vast, interconnected web of sensations, each one unique and fleeting.
That's a great example of how Bakewell helps us see the world through Sartre's eyes. Imagine walking down the street and you suddenly see everything as if for the first time. You're noticing details you'd never even thought about before. It's about cultivating the sense of wonder, this awareness of how rich our everyday experiences really are.
It definitely makes you think about how often we're just on autopilot, We're not really seeing or appreciating the world around us.
Exactly. And phenomenology, as Bakewell describes it, it's all about waking up to the world, becoming more present, more aware, more alive to the richness of our experience.
Okay, so Bakewell also points out the humor and the absurdity even of existentialism. She talks about Sartre and his friends. They're gathering in these smoky cafes, they're drinking apricot cocktails, and they're debating the meaning of life, which is, well, kind of a funny image when you think about it.
I know, right? But it's a good reminder that these were real people, grappling with real life questions in a way that feels relatable, even if their ideas are, sometimes kind of challenging. They weren't just sitting around in ivory towers pondering abstract theories. They were out in the world, living their lives, falling in love, arguing with friends, and yeah, even enjoying a good apricot cocktail now and then.
It definitely makes them seem less intimidating, more human. And speaking of human, let's talk about one of the most human aspects of their lives, their relationships. Bakewell, she really dives into the complexities of Sartre and de Beauvoir's very unconventional partnership.
Yeah, their relationship was definitely unique. I mean, they were intellectual equals, collaborators, lovers, but they also had an open relationship. Both of them pursued other romantic partners throughout their lives. Bakewell, she quotes de Beauvoir saying, "Our relationship was based on freedom and mutual respect." They challenged every traditional notion of love and commitment, They created a partnership that was both deeply intimate and fiercely independent.
It was definitely a relationship that pushed boundaries, just like their philosophy did, right?
Exactly. And Bakewell explores how their relationship, with all its complexities and contradictions, it both influenced and reflected their philosophical ideas about freedom, authenticity, the complexities of human connection, all of it.
Their story really shows how intertwined their lives and their ideas were, doesn't it?
It does. And it reminds us that philosophy isn't just about abstract concepts. It's about how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, how we make choices that shape who we become. Ready for another round of apricot cocktails? We're about to delve even deeper into existentialist territory.
I'm always up for a good cocktail, especially when it's paired with philosophical discussions. So where are we headed next in our existentialism deep dive?
Well, we've spent a lot of time with Sartre and de Beauvoir, but Bakewell introduces us to a whole group of thinkers who were grappling with those big questions about freedom, meaning, and, existence. Let's talk about Albert Camus. He's a figure who often gets labeled as an existentialist, even though, well, he actually rejected that label.
Yeah, I remember reading that Camus very much had his own distinct way of thinking. What were some of his main ideas, and how did they differ from the other existentialists?
Camus, he was an Algerian-born writer and philosopher, and he really wrestled with this concept of absurdity, the clash between our very human desire for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference to that desire. His most famous work, The Myth of Sisyphus, it uses the Greek myth of Sisyphus to explore this. Sisyphus, he was condemned to eternally push this boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time.
That sounds incredibly frustrating. So what was Camus' point with that story?
Camus saw Sisyphus as a symbol of, well, the human condition. We struggle, we strive, we search for meaning, but ultimately our efforts can seem pretty futile in the face of this vast, indifferent universe. But here's where Camus diverges from, say, Sartre. Instead of just giving in to despair, Camus argued that we should embrace the absurdity, even rebel against it.
Rebel against meaninglessness. How do you even do that?
For Camus, rebellion wasn't about, overthrowing some external force or something. It was about finding meaning and purpose within that absurdity. He saw it as a way of affirming our own humanity, our own values, even when the universe just doesn't seem to care.
So it's like a defiant kind of hope, in a way. Instead of giving up, you find meaning in the struggle itself, even without a guarantee of, a happy ending or anything.
Exactly. Camus believed that acknowledging the absurdity of life actually freed us to live fully and passionately, finding joy in simply being alive.
It's like a reminder that even in a world that feels meaningless, we still have the choice of how we respond, how we create our own meaning.
And Bakewell really brings this to life when she describes Camus during World War II. He joined the French resistance, he risked his life fighting Nazi oppression, and his writing was all about the need to stand up to injustice. He embodied this idea of rebellion by fighting for a more just and humane world, even when the odds were stacked against him.
It's a powerful example of how existentialist ideas, even the ones rooted in absurdity, can lead to action and engagement with the world.
It reminds us that existentialism isn't some kind of abstract philosophy that you just think about. It's about how we choose to live, how we face challenges, and how we create meaning in a world that can be pretty unpredictable and even chaotic.
Okay, speaking of facing challenges, Bakewell delves into something that can be really tough to talk about. Martin Heidegger's involvement with Nazism. It's a dark side to a philosopher who, as we discussed earlier, made some important contributions to existentialism.
Yeah, it's not an easy conversation, but it's a really important one. Heidegger, he joined the Nazi Party in 1933 and stayed a member for 10 years. Bakewell doesn't shy away from this complicated part of his life, She asks these hard questions about how a brilliant philosopher could be drawn to such a harmful ideology.
It's a stark reminder that brilliance doesn't equal morality, right? Even philosophers, people we often see as, champions of reason and ethics, they can make terrible choices.
It's a sobering thought for sure, and it raises all these questions about whether his philosophy somehow connects to his political choices, or if his support for Nazism was more of a personal failing, something separate from his intellectual work. It's a debate that hasn't really gone away.
I think it also reminds us how crucial critical thinking is. We can't just blindly accept ideas because they come from respected figures. We need to scrutinize all ideas, especially the powerful ones, and hold people accountable for what their actions lead to.
Absolutely. Bakewell doesn't try to give easy answers, but she encourages us to, really wrestle with these complexities. She acknowledges how brilliant his work is, but she also condemns his moral failures.
It's a reminder that we can learn from the past, even from the darkest parts of it, and that we have a responsibility to watch out for the allure of harmful ideologies. Okay, so let's shift gears for a bit and talk about a figure who brought a different perspective to the existentialist landscape. Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Ah, Merleau-Ponty. He's the philosopher who brought the body into existentialist thought. He was fascinated by the connection between our physical experiences and our consciousness. He believed our bodies weren't just vessels for our minds, but actually integral to how we perceive and understand the world.
That's interesting. Can you give an example of what you mean?
Bakewell uses this great example of a blind man with a cane. Merleau-Ponty argued that for the blind man, the cane isn't just a tool, it actually becomes part of his body, a way of sensing and interacting with the world.
So it's almost like the cane becomes part of how he experiences being in the world, part of his consciousness even.
Exactly. Merleau-Ponty was saying that we don't experience the world from this, like, detached, objective viewpoint. We experience it through our bodies, through our senses, through our movements.
That makes me think about, like, dancers. They're so attuned to their bodies, to their every movement, that it almost becomes a language for them, a way of expressing themselves and connecting with the world.
That's a perfect example. And Merleau-Ponty's ideas had a big impact on Simone de Beauvoir, especially in her work on gender. She used his concept of the lived body to explore how women's experiences, things like pregnancy, childbirth, menstruation, those have shaped their social and cultural roles.
It's amazing how these philosophical ideas can help us understand our own experiences in totally new ways. It's like they give us this whole new language for thinking about things we might have taken for granted.
You get it right on the head. Now, Bakewell really captures the atmosphere of the time and place where all these ideas were taking shape. She paints such a vivid picture of Paris in the 1930s and 40s, a time of intellectual ferment, political upheaval, and this incredible creative energy.
I love how she describes those smoky cafes where all the existentialists hung out, the air thick with cigarette smoke and philosophical debate. She writes, the cafes were their laboratories, their stages, their battlegrounds.
Yeah.
It makes you feel like you're right there, caught up in the energy of their conversations.
I know, right? And it's not just the cafes. Bakewell talks about jazz clubs, art galleries, political rallies, all these places where the existentialists were engaging with the world, challenging conventions, trying to create something new. It was a time of massive uncertainty, but also a time of incredible possibility.
It almost makes you wish you could travel back in time and just observe them in those cafes.
Me too. Bakewell's descriptions really capture that sense of energy and excitement.
Now, earlier you mentioned how Camus rejected the label existentialist. Were there other thinkers who got associated with the movement but had their own unique perspectives?
Absolutely. Existentialism wasn't this, like, rigid movement with a fixed set of rules. It was more like a loose group of thinkers who shared some common concerns and ideas, but approached them in their own individual ways.
So it was more like a conversation, a dialogue, than a strict ideology.
That's a great way to put it. And Bakewell captures that conversational quality really well. She shows how these thinkers constantly challenged each other, pushing each other's ideas further, and refining their own thinking through debate and dialogue.
So it's like they were all working on this puzzle together, each one contributing a piece, even if they didn't always agree on how the pieces fit.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes existentialism so interesting and dynamic. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about exploring different perspectives, wrestling with the tough questions, and creating meaning in a world that doesn't always offer easy solutions.
We've talked a lot about the philosophical ideas, but Bakewell also explores how these ideas move from theory to action, how they influence things like art, literature, even political movements.
That's what makes this book so compelling. It's not just about theories, it's about how existentialism showed up in the real world. Bakewell traces its influence in everything from the novels of Camus and de Beauvoir to the plays of Samuel Beckett and the films of Jean-Luc Godard.
It's amazing to think about the lasting impact these philosophers have had, even on people who might not realize they're engaging with existentialist ideas.
You see it everywhere, in art, literature, film, music, this questioning of traditional values, this emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility, this search for meaning in a world that can often feel absurd. It's a thread that runs through so much of 20th and 21st century culture.
Now, Bakewell spends quite a bit of time on Edmund Husserl, who we talked about earlier as the father of phenomenology. She really dives into his ideas about consciousness and perception and how those ideas laid the groundwork for existentialism.
Yeah, Husserl's work can be pretty dense and challenging, but Bakewell makes it so much more accessible. She explains how he developed this method called bracketing, which is all about setting aside our preconceived notions and biases and just experiencing the world as it is, in its raw, immediate form.
It sounds like a kind of mental discipline, a way of training your mind to see things with fresh eyes.
Exactly. Husserl was obsessed with this idea of going back to the things themselves, meaning experiencing the world without imposing our own categories and interpretations on it.
So it's about stripping away all the layers of meaning that we've built up over time and just encountering the world with a sense of openness and curiosity.
Precisely. And this way of experiencing the world with this emphasis on direct, lived experience, it became a cornerstone of existentialism.
Bakewell doesn't just present Husserl as some abstract thinker, though. She also gives us a glimpse into his personal life, his struggles, his triumphs. She talks about how he lost two of his sons in World War I and how he faced anti-Semitism as a Jewish academic in Germany.
Right. It's a reminder that these philosophers weren't just living in some ivory tower detached from the real world. They were grappling with real-life challenges, and their ideas were shaped by their own experiences, their own struggles.
It makes their work all the more human, all the more relatable. It's not just about abstract theories. It's about how we make sense of life in a world that can be both beautiful and heartbreaking, joyful and tragic, all at the same time.
And that's one of the things that makes existentialism so enduringly relevant. It speaks to this deep human need to find meaning and purpose, even when we're facing absurdity, suffering, and loss.
Now, Bakewell doesn't shy away from the fact that these philosophers' lives were full of complexities and contradictions. She points out, for example, that while Sartre was a vocal advocate for freedom and individual responsibility, he also had this complicated relationship with political power and authority.
That's true. He supported communist causes, but was also critical of totalitarian regimes. Bakewell doesn't try to smooth over these contradictions. She presents them as part of the messy reality of trying to live out your philosophical beliefs in a world that's complex and often doesn't fit neatly into categories.
It makes him feel more human, more relatable, even if we might not always agree with his conclusions. It's like she's reminding us that none of these thinkers had all the answers, and that the search for meaning is an ongoing process full of twists and turns and sometimes even contradictions.
Exactly. And that's what makes existentialism so compelling. It's not about finding a set of prepackaged answers. It's about engaging in this lifelong process of questioning, exploring, and creating meaning in a world that doesn't offer easy solutions.
Okay, so let's dig into a concept that Bakewell keeps coming back to: the importance of phenomenological seeing.
Phenomenological seeing is all about trying to see the world with fresh eyes, without all those preconceived notions and biases we carry around. It's about paying attention to the raw data of our senses and trying to understand the essence of our experiences.
So instead of relying on assumptions or theories, we try to see things as they truly are, in their rawest form.
Precisely. And it's harder than it sounds. We're so used to filtering the world through our own beliefs, expectations, and categories. But phenomenological seeing is about trying to, put those preconceptions aside and see the world anew, as if for the first time.
It's almost like a mindfulness practice, right? A way of being more present, paying attention to the details, and appreciating the richness and complexity of what we're experiencing.
You got it. And Bakewell uses the example of Sartre experiencing this chestnut tree in a Parisian park to illustrate this idea. Sartre described trying to see the tree not as a tree with all the baggage that word carries, but as this unique, singular being with its own particular shape, texture, and presence in the world.
So instead of seeing a tree, you might see the rough texture of its bark, the way the sunlight filters through its leaves, the intricate patterns of its branches, all without labeling it or putting it in a box.
Exactly. That's the key to phenomenological seeing. Encountering the world in its immediacy, in its raw, unfiltered essence.
That's a pretty powerful idea. It makes me wonder how we can develop that kind of seeing in our own lives. Is it something we can practice, or is it more like a sudden shift in perspective?
Bakewell suggests it's something we can cultivate through practice. It's about paying attention to the details, the sensations, the present moment, noticing things we might have overlooked before, seeing the familiar as if for the first time.
It was about waking up to the world, becoming more aware of our own perceptions and how they shape our experience.
Exactly. And it's not just about seeing, it's about all our senses. Hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. It's about being fully present in our bodies and the world.
That sounds both challenging and rewarding. It's like a constant process of rediscovering the world, finding new layers of meaning and beauty in the everyday.
It is, and it's a reminder that even in a world that can feel familiar and routine, there's always more to see, more to experience, if we're open to it.
Okay, so let's talk about another concept Bakewell explores: Heidegger's notion of the they.
The they. It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling concept. It refers to this kind of anonymous, impersonal force that can shape our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. It's the pressure to conform, to do what's expected, to fit in with the crowd.
So it's that feeling of being judged or pressured to conform to social norms, even when those norms don't really align with our own values or desires.
Exactly. And Heidegger believed that the they can be a powerful force, one that can actually stifle our individuality and our freedom. It makes us afraid to be ourselves, to stand out, to pursue our own unique paths.
It's like living someone else's life instead of our own, letting the they dictate our choices and our identity.
That's a great way to put it. And that's the danger of the they, according to Heidegger. It can make us lose sight of our authentic selves, our own values, our own desires.
So how do we resist the they? How do we break free from that pressure to conform and start living more authentically?
It's not easy. It requires a real commitment to self-awareness, to questioning our assumptions, and to choosing our own paths, even when they go against the grain. It's about being willing to be different, to stand out, to embrace what makes us unique.
So it's about having the courage to be ourselves, even when it feels uncomfortable or risky. It's about recognizing that the opinions of they don't define us, and that we have the power to choose our own values and live by them.
Exactly. Bakewell even offers some practical suggestions for cultivating this kind of authenticity. She talks about the importance of paying attention to our own inner voice, questioning our assumptions, and being willing to challenge the status quo.
It's about being mindful of our own thoughts and feelings, and making choices that reflect our deepest values, even if those choices aren't popular or conventional.
You got it. And it's about action, too. Authenticity isn't just about thinking the right thoughts. It's about living in accordance with those thoughts, making choices that reflect our true selves.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Having the courage to be different, to embrace our individuality, and to live a life that's true to ourselves.
That's the essence of existentialism. And Bakewell's book is such a compelling and accessible guide to this whole philosophical movement.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the key figures and ideas of existentialism. But what is existentialism, really? What are its core tenets?
Existentialism is a philosophical movement that emphasizes individual existence, freedom, and choice. It's about recognizing that we're each responsible for creating our own meaning and purpose in life. There's no preordained plan, no set path. We're thrown into existence, as Heidegger put it, and we have to figure things out as we go.
So it's about embracing the unknown, the uncertainty, and recognizing that we are the authors of our own stories.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that with freedom comes responsibility. We're free to choose our own paths, but we're also accountable for the consequences of those choices.
That can feel both liberating and terrifying at the same time. Liberating because we have the power to shape our lives, but terrifying because we can't blame anyone else for our choices or our mistakes.
You got it. That tension, that feeling of both freedom and responsibility is at the heart of existentialism.
Now, Bakewell's book doesn't shy away from the fact that existentialism can be pretty daunting. If there's no preordained plan, no set path, it can be hard to know where to even begin. How does Bakewell suggest we approach that challenge?
Well, she suggests we start by paying attention to what truly matters to us, the things that give our lives meaning and purpose. It's about identifying our values, our passions, the things that make us feel alive.
So it's about figuring out what makes our hearts sing, what makes us want to jump out of bed in the morning, and using those things as a guide for our choices and actions.
Exactly. And once we've identified those things, we can start making choices that align with them, even if those choices are difficult or unconventional. Bakewell emphasizes that there's no one right way to live an existentialist life. What matters is that we're making choices that are true to ourselves.
That's really empowering. It's about taking ownership of our lives and creating a path that feels authentic and meaningful for us, even if it looks different from what society might expect.
And it's about recognizing that it's an ongoing process. There's no finish line, no point where we've achieved perfect authenticity. It's a journey of constant exploration, questioning, and growth.
Now, Bakewell also delves into the relationship between existentialism and religion, which I imagine can be a complex and even contentious topic.
It definitely is. A lot of existentialist thinkers were atheists, or at least deeply skeptical of traditional religious beliefs. But they weren't necessarily hostile to religion. They were more interested in exploring the human condition, the meaning of life, the nature of existence, questions that have traditionally fallen under religion.
So they were more focused on the big existential questions than on adhering to any specific religious doctrine. It's like they were taking those big questions that religion often grapples with and exploring them from a more philosophical and human-centered perspective.
Exactly. And some existentialist thinkers, like Gabriel Marcel, actually embraced a form of Christian existentialism. They saw existentialism as a way of deepening religious faith, of grappling with the mystery and wonder of existence in a way that went beyond dogma and ritual.
It's interesting how existentialism can be interpreted in so many different ways, depending on one's own beliefs and worldview.
That's what makes it such a rich and multifaceted tradition. And Bakewell does a great job of exploring these different perspectives and showing how existentialism has spoken to people from such a wide range of backgrounds and beliefs.
Now let's talk about a concept that Bakewell brings up in the context of Heidegger and the they, thrownness.
Thrownness refers to the idea that we're all kind of tossed into existence without our consent. We don't choose to be born, we don't choose our families, we don't choose the circumstances of our lives. We're just here, thrown into the middle of it all. Heidegger believed that this thrownness, this fundamental contingency of our existence, was also the source of our freedom.
That's a pretty wild idea when you really think about it. It's like saying we're all dealt a random hand of cards, and it's up to us to figure out how to play them.
Exactly. And that can be both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means we have the power to create our own meaning and purpose, but terrifying because it means there's no rule book, no guarantee of success.
It's like we're all improvising, making it up as we go along.
And that's the existential challenge, according to Heidegger. Embracing our thrownness, accepting the absurdity and contingency of our existence, and creating meaning and purpose in the face of it all.
Now, Bakewell doesn't just focus on the philosophical giants. She also introduces us to some lesser-known figures who played important roles in developing existentialist thought. One of those is Simone Weil, a French philosopher and mystic who had a profound impact on Camus.
Bakewell was a fascinating and complex figure. She was deeply committed to social justice and lived a life of radical simplicity and self-denial. She also had a mystical side, believing that suffering could lead to spiritual enlightenment.
She sounds like a very intense person.
She was, and her ideas are often controversial. But Camus was really influenced by her, especially by her ideas about compassion and the importance of confronting suffering.
So even though she wasn't a card-carrying existentialist, her ideas helped shape how existentialist thought developed.
Exactly. And Bakewell does a great job of showing how all these different intellectual threads were interwoven, how these thinkers were influencing each other, challenging each other, and building on each other's ideas.
It's like a giant tapestry with all these different colors and textures coming together to create something beautiful and complex.
That's a great way to put it. And Bakewell's book is like a guide to that tapestry, helping us see the individual threads and how they all connect to create this rich and multifaceted philosophical movement.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, from Sartre and Beauvoir to Camus and Merleau-Ponty, from Phenomenology to thrownness to the they. I think I need another apricot cocktail to process all this.
I hear you.
Yeah.
But before we take a break, let's talk about how Bakewell suggests we can apply these existentialist ideas to our own lives. It can feel pretty daunting to think about creating our own meaning in a world that often feels meaningless. Where do we even begin?
Right, it's like, okay, I'm free, but now what? What do I do with all this freedom?
Bakewell offers some really helpful and practical advice. She suggests we start by paying attention to the things that are important to us, the things that give our lives meaning and purpose. What are our values? What are our passions? What makes us feel truly alive? Bakewell quotes Nietzsche, a philosopher who really influenced the existentialists. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow.
It's about finding our why, that driving force that gives us direction and motivation, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And once we've figured out our why, we can start making choices that align with it, even if those choices are difficult or unconventional. Bakewell reminds us that there's no one right way to live an existentialist life. What matters is finding a path that feels authentic and meaningful to you.
So it's not about following some predetermined set of rules or doctrines. It's about creating a life that feels true to ourselves.
That's the heart of existentialism. Now, Bakewell also talks about the importance of action. It's not enough to just think about these ideas we have, to put them into practice in our everyday lives. She writes, existentialism is not a philosophy of armchair speculation. It's a philosophy of engagement, of commitment, of action.
So it's not just about thinking the right thoughts. It's about living those thoughts, making choices that reflect our values, even if it means taking risks or going outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. And she emphasizes that it's an ongoing process, full of trial and error. We're going to make mistakes, we're going to stumble, but that's part of the journey. The key is to learn from our experiences and keep moving forward, keep striving to live more authentically.
It's about embracing the messiness and uncertainty of life and recognizing that there's no finish line, no point where we've achieved perfect authenticity. It's a constant process of becoming.
You got it. Now, one thing I found particularly helpful was Bakewell's discussion of how to deal with anxiety. Existentialism can be pretty anxiety-provoking, especially when you start thinking about the vastness and uncertainty of existence. But Bakewell offers some practical suggestions for how to manage that anxiety.
I'm all ears. Give me the existentialist anxiety-busting tips.
One of her key suggestions is to focus on what we can control. We can't control the universe, we can't control other people, but we can control our own choices and actions.
So it's about shifting our focus from the things that are outside of our control to the things we can influence, even if it's just our own attitude and responses to challenging situations.
Exactly. And she also emphasizes the importance of finding meaning and purpose in the everyday. We don't need to wait for some big life-altering event to find meaning. We can find it in the simple things, in our relationships, in our work, in our hobbies, in the beauty of the natural world.
It's about appreciating the small moments, the everyday joys, and finding a sense of gratitude for simply being alive.
Beautifully put. And she also encourages us to embrace uncertainty. Life is unpredictable, and we're never going to have all the answers. Instead of trying to control everything, she suggests that we learn to be comfortable with not knowing, with embracing the mystery and the open-endedness of existence.
That's a tough one, I think, especially in a culture that values certainty and control. But it's a powerful idea, learning to let go of the need to know everything and just be present in the moment with all its uncertainties and possibilities.
It's a challenge, but it's also a source of freedom. When we let go of the need for certainty, we open ourselves up to new experiences, new ways of thinking, new possibilities.
Now, Bakewell's book isn't just about the intellectual side of existentialism. She also delves into the emotional and even spiritual dimensions of this philosophy. She talks about the importance of finding beauty and meaning in a world that can often feel absurd and meaningless.
That's one of the things I appreciate most about her approach. She acknowledges the darkness, the anxiety, the absurdity, but she also reminds us that there's beauty, there's joy, there's connection to be found, even in the midst of all that.
She does such a fantastic job of bringing those ideas to life through the stories of these fascinating and flawed individuals who are wrestling with these questions. She shows us how they found meaning in their relationships, in their art, in their political activism, in their everyday lives. It's inspiring, really, to see how they managed to create lives of purpose and passion, even when facing adversity.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a reminder that we all have that capacity within us. We can all choose to live more consciously, more authentically, more meaningfully, even if it's not always easy. I couldn't agree more. And it's a good reminder that we all have that capacity, right? We can all choose to live a little more consciously, more authentically, more meaningfully, even if it's not always easy.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into existentialism, what would you say are, the key takeaways from Bakewell's at the Existentialist Café?
Well, I think first and foremost, it reminds us that existentialism, it's not just some, dusty old philosophy textbook. It's a really vibrant, living tradition that speaks to something fundamental about being human, right? That search for meaning and purpose, especially in a world that often feels, I don't know, meaningless and kind of absurd.
And it's not about finding a prepackaged set of answers, right? It's about, embracing our freedom, taking responsibility for the choices we make, and kind of creating our own meaning in a world that doesn't always give us easy solutions.
And recognizing that we're not alone in that journey, that those connections we have with other people, they're essential to our own growth and development.
Yeah, and it's about cultivating that sense of wonder, that curiosity, that openness to the world around us. It's about, really paying attention to the details, appreciating those little everyday moments, and finding beauty and meaning even in the absurdity.
I love that. Beautifully said. And, if you're looking for a book that's gonna challenge you, inspire you to maybe live a little more authentically and help you find meaning, even when the world feels kind of meaningless, then I definitely recommend checking out at the Existentialist Café.
Yeah, it's really a captivating journey through this fascinating philosophical movement, perfect for, I think, anyone who's ever kind of wondered about the meaning of life and who wants to find their own unique answers.
And hey, maybe even pour yourself an apricot cocktail while you're at it, right?
I love that idea. Cheers to existentialism, to freedom, to apricot cocktails, and to the never-ending search for meaning, right?
Yeah.
In this crazy and wonderful world.
Cheers to that.
So that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you enjoyed exploring these complex and thought-provoking issues with us.
This is Alex and Eve.
Until next time, keep those notes of curiosity flowing.